The Tom Woods Show, episode 1338.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Homeschooling families, it's the middle of the academic year, and that's when a lot of families decide to ditch the curriculum they're using and try something better. Well, if you want to maintain your mental health and give your kids an outstanding education, then check out the self-taught Ron Paul curriculum. And when you use my link, you get $160 worth of free bonuses as well. My link is ronpaulhomeschool.com. Hey everybody, it's Tom Woods, and in this episode, I'm reproducing an interview I did on a podcast called Something's Off with Andrew Heaton. Andrew Heaton has been a guest on this program, and he is a stand-up comedian, very funny guy, great guy. He's had a segment for a long time with Reason TV called Mostly Weekly. And right now, he's got a great gig over at The Blaze. TheBlaze.com is the host of his podcast, which is Something's Off with Andrew Heaton. And he's just a great host. He's an interesting guy. He's a fun guy. He's a little bit more, shall we say, middle-of-the-road libertarian than I am. But he's such a charming and wonderful fellow that, well, I can overlook that. So we had a nice conversation. He wanted to talk about the development of the idea that society is not just a random series of events, but that there are certain regularities to it, that there's a sense in which it runs itself, it's self-regulating. And sometimes this is referred to as spontaneous order. I'm not a huge fan of that expression. I'm not quite sure why. Something about it makes me crazy, but that's the general topic that we were unpacking, and we had a very good time doing it. So that's what you're about to hear right here, and if you like what you hear, check out Andrew's podcast over at theblaze.com, or of course you can just find it on iTunes. Just type in Something's Off, and Something's Off with Andrew Heaton will pop right up. Here we go.
Tom, thank you for joining me.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, Andrew.
Yeah. So I want to apologize to you and the listeners in advance in that I think you are a walking encyclopedia of history, from what I can tell. I don't think I can catch up with you at any point. I've done my best for the material today, but you're going to definitely outpace me. I hope I can at least stay abreast based on kind of what I want to talk to you about, which is the Enlightenment and some of the things that came out of it. And I want to begin by sharing a pet theory I have with you and then kind of unpacking it from there. I think that the natural tendency of mankind is to assume we need a person with a bullhorn shouting at us and organizing us to do things. And one of the most powerful things to come out of the Enlightenment was the concept of emergent order, which is the idea that something can be organized without having a central organizer. You can have order without an organizer, basically. And I think that we're actually seeing a kind of regression on behalf of a lot of our friends in the progressive movement, or specifically technocrats in Europe, who I think kind of want to have that old feudal structure. It's just that they want to swap out the inbred aristocrats and put in academics, but they still want to have those leaders kind of micromanaging things and having a command economy. So your thoughts on that, and then we'll kind of go backwards from there.
I can understand why people might think this. It seems to make sense. I mean, there's a way in which it even seems, on first glance, that a planned economy on the Soviet model, to the unaided intellect, may seem to be the best approach. Because wouldn't it be better to have a small committee running things, giving orders, coming up with plans, and figuring out who should produce what and where and what quantities? It seems like that we bring intelligence to bear on production. That should have a better, more orderly outcome than if we just said, "Hey, everybody, you just go out and do whatever you want to do."
Which I can understand I can understand the impetus behind that. Like we've now observed the Soviet Union and we've observed command economies. They don't tend to work very well.
So it turns out it doesn't work out that way, right? So in other words, our first instinct that maybe we just need people with bullhorns ordering everybody around. It turns out that's not the case, and that in fact, when you do leave people free to decide what business they're going to enter and what product they're going to produce and how they're going to produce it and where and in what quantities, it turns out when you leave people free to do that, you actually get the most extraordinary kind of order. And that to me, that is the extraordinary development of the past few centuries. I think it's the most important intellectual advance that I can think of.
And it's definitely a paradigm shift as well. It's not just like instead of having a king, we're going to have a parliament. It's not just swapping out who's in power.
Right.
It is a fundamental rethink of the nature of power itself.
The idea that so much in society can run itself and that it does not need outside force. For example, we can think about examples that we see in our daily lives, but we see them so often, we're blind to them. So, for instance, I've sometimes, along with my friend Bob Murphy, given the example of physics as a discipline, academic discipline. Now, there's nobody in charge of physics. There's no president of physics.
Thank God.
And yet, physics proceeds unimpeded. We have a wonderful discipline of physics, and we have different academics and writing in academic journals and having conferences, but there's nobody running physics, and yet there it is. And nobody would say, boy, physics really, really needs a kick in the rear end by a good military dictator. It would never occur to us to think that way.
Yeah, we need a brigadier professor of physics to organize all of those physics professors to get in line and research the correct things.
We need a military coup in physics. It would not occur to somebody to think this way. Or even the English language itself. It wasn't that there was some guy standing under a tree one day and he somehow barked out at everybody what the different words for the different objects were. It developed spontaneously, again, with nobody in charge. And so then when you look around and you realize that, right now I'm actually holding a pencil in my hand, taking some notes here. When you look at, as a lot of libertarians know, the complexity of that pencil from the point of view of think of everything you need to do just to chop down the wood for the pencil. Well, you have to have steel for the saw, and so that means you have to get into mining and iron ore and the production of steel, and then you need rubber for the tires to transport the steel. You need gasoline, which means you have to drill for oil. I mean, when you and I haven't even gotten to the rubber for the eraser, the
right.
steel, the paint, and all this stuff. You would think if we just looked at all the complicated inputs, you'd think, yeah, I think we're going to need a pencil czar ordering everybody around, telling them what to do and when to do it. But yet we don't. We just
Pencil czar does sound like a delightful Pixar movie. Like that could be some kind of back to school special of. I'm not sure what it would be, but it sounds fun.
We'd be a lot better off if the only czars were pencil czars. But the beautiful thing about it.
Can I? Go ahead. Go ahead and finish. Yeah.
Well, just to say that, yet somehow we have this amazing result of this wonderful little device, and we don't have shortages of it. We don't have huge surpluses of it. We get them in just the right quantity at just the right time with all these people cooperating all over the world to produce all the stuff, and there's no bullhorn guy ordering them around.
Now, to play devil's advocate for a moment, I think that my progressive friends would probably not espouse that there should be a brigadier general of physics. However, they would say that there ought to be a funding mechanism from the state to go to basic fundamental research and applied research and that kind of thing. So where would you place that in this kind of intellectual org chart of state directed funding but not state directed research mandates?
Well, there are cases like for example, if we give people welfare payments, we give them the money and then they go out and buy what they need. But in other cases, like with the schools, the government gives the funding and the school itself. So in a case like this, they might say, well, we're willing to let private scientists do their thing, but they need the funding from the government. And it turns out that this is more myth than reality. When we actually look back at the history of government funding of science, it's actually not really that impressive a record. In the 19th century, the British were the undisputed scientific leaders of the world. They pioneered with the Industrial Revolution. They had some of the most world-renowned scientists, and yet the amount of government funding of science in Britain was literally zero, and nothing. Whereas France and Germany had a lot of government funding of science, and they lagged considerably behind. And what's happened in the 20th century is, as the government has gotten involved, it's not that now there's more funding of science, it's that instead of people donating to it or industrial sources of the scientific work, it's just government funding, which has generally not been as much money as had been given before. And then also, most people have the wrong idea of where science comes from. They think that it's scientists working in lab coats, just piddling around trying to see what works and what doesn't, and that's where science comes from. Actually, the overwhelming majority of scientific progress comes from building on existing technology to improve it. And that tends to happen on the spot. Like, for example, the steam engine was not developed by men in lab coats looking for an invention. To the contrary, it was people unhappy with existing technology who made constant adjustments and then developed these new technologies. So a lot of it takes place kind of on the job, so to speak. So the idea that we need a huge amount of funding for so-called basic science is not true. Basic science contributes very, very little to scientific progress. And moreover, Japan has very little government funding of science. They have some universities, but mainly industrial laboratories is where their scientific progress takes place. So a lot of this is the state wants us to think that without them, we'd be backward, we'd all be worshiping Thor, and we'd have no progress.
It does. That sounds like a fun weekend, but yeah, probably not the thing to shoot for.
But it turns, and there's a fantastic book on it. This fellow named Terence Keeley wrote this book called The Economic Laws of Scientific Research, and he became like a pariah in the scientific community because they don't care what the truth of the matter is. They want their subsidies. Doggone it, I want my money.
I think really in any category, in almost any private or any sector, generally speaking, if you criticize the flow of money coming in, it's going to be problematic. If there were and I hope there never is one, if there were a federal department of podcasts that allotted money to try and incur. I can't even bring myself to bring out the sentence because I think the results of it would be so horrid. But if you were to try and cut that, there would be a lot of podcasters that would all of a sudden rebel against it and probably strike out against anybody saying, maybe this could sort itself out on its own.
Right, and moreover, we might add, as we would clearly see with a federal department of podcasts, there would be almost certainly some kind of political bias creeping into the funding.
I would assume so. That's one of the things I find interesting when I talk to. There's this kind of I can't even quite wrap my mind around it. I actually got into a conversation the other day on Facebook. A couple of my friends and I were going back and forth. One of my friends was talking about the BBC and what I thought of the BBC, which I like the BBC. I don't want to try and replicate that in the United States, though. And one of the things I pointed out was, you guys are aware that Donald Trump is the head of our government, right? And then the response from my progressive friends was like, well, we just need to not elect Republicans. And I think if you're trying to design a political system in which you never lose, it's not a very good political system. That does not seem like a very robust model to accept.
Right, where every 4 years, everything you cherish could potentially be up for grabs. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's really the best you can come up with.
Yeah. As opposed to, get your podcast off of Patreon. Not that much of a problem if a new president comes in, as long as he or she's not messing with freedom of speech. Then you can do whatever you need to, independent of that. I'll add as well. I think in terms of the psychology here, I find that, and I'm guilty of this as well. But trying to look at things that could be handled by spontaneous order is even harder than it is to just sort of allow things to develop in that direction. And what I mean by that, an example that I've heard I think is great is if we lived in a world where there was a federal department of shoe distribution, where everyone in America got their shoes from the federal government, were you and I to come in and go, you know what? I think the private sector can completely handle this one. I think 100% the response would be, we're monsters. We don't think people deserve shoes. We don't think they need shoes. How can we possibly think that something so fundamental as shoe wear could be trusted to something so ephemeral as the private sector, when in reality that it's working fantastic right now. I don't know of anyone who thinks that lack of shoes is a significant problem in the United States, even for people in poverty.
Or they would come up with bizarre problems that the private sector would supposedly have. Like maybe we would buy a pair of shoes and one would be longer than the other. But I suppose that's, in principle, that's possible. But why would a company do that? It's like we couldn't have the private sector produce batteries. Why every company would have a different size battery for its product. But everyone would hate that. So, of course, we wouldn't have that.
Well, and then the immediate counterexample with the shoes is like you can go to, this might be anecdotal, but I think it's correct. Like there in Soviet Russia and maybe in China, they would have, a factory that only made left shoes and another factory that only made right shoes. And one of the factories would just be more efficient. And as a result, they'd have more right shoes than left shoes. So occasionally, if you're in a shoe line, you would get 2 left shoes. And that you're less likely to see that kind of thing in a market economy where the people selling the shoes are a lot more aware of the demand for them than a distant command and control bureaucrat.
Well, ain't that so? So it turns out that when I try to come up with crazy stories, they've actually occurred in the actual history of economic planning.
Well, and so that brings me to the history of it, because I try and get into the mindset of sort of pre-Enlightenment people periodically, because there's so many things that we take for granted as being normal, and I'm not sure whether they're innate or whether they're societal. But if we go pre-Enlightenment, the thinking is very different. So, sticking with emergent order for the moment, I'm curious. Do you think this man with a bullhorn model? Do you think that's just inertia that we're fighting, or do you think that's actually an innate psychological tendency that is always going to be there?
I don't know if it's innate, but I do know that what you and I are saying in this episode is counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Because, as I say, your natural inclination is to think that
put an expert in charge, find the smartest person, and put them in control of it.
We need to apply human intelligence to this problem. We can't just have people running around doing whatever they want. And yet, in case after case, that's precisely what yields you amazing outcomes. So I think and I think also most people don't sit around pondering big issues like this. They just go with what their gut tells them, which is, frankly, why we have so many people who have strong opinions on economic matters who really don't understand anything involved at all.
Someone once said that the amount of people that think they understand something because they've heard of it is staggering, and I very firmly hold that opinion. I've met a lot of people that they read about something one time in one article that they saw in The Guardian, and that is sufficient information for them, and they are an expert on it now. So who kind of flips the lid on spontaneous order? I mean, I think of Hayek as kind of the patron saint of it, or the apotheosis of emergent order, but he's later in the game. I mean, he's 20th century. So who kind of kicks this off in the Enlightenment of maybe we don't need someone in charge?
Well, I'm going to go even back a little bit before that, and I'm going to talk about people who have never been mentioned in the history of podcasting. I'm going to venture. And if I get it, I want a very firm handshake from you the next time we escape a room. Okay, I think I know. I know you know it. Okay, so what do you think I'm going to say?
I think you're going to bring up the Chinese philosopher Xuanzi.
Oh no, but I'll still shake your hand.
Thank you. I appreciate
you're
that,
a good
Tom.
man.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I get bonus points for trying.
Or how about next time I see you, I'll just give you a thumbs up.
Thank you. I'll take that. I'll take that. Well, because are you a Rothbardian, or you're a Rothbard
fan? I am. Well,
okay.
Did you read his History of Economic Thought? Is that where you were getting at?
Part of it. I've not read it in its entirety, but I know that he sort of identified Xuanzi, who for those listening, I'm utterly unfamiliar with Xuanzi. I know that he was sort of a Confucianism, which was the dominant form of thought in China for a very long time, which was a very, very orderly, inertia, protocol-based philosophy. He was sort of an anti-Confucius, and he was quoted as saying, good order results spontaneously when things are let alone. So Rothbard sort of saw him as the first recorded proponent. However, I think we can look at China today and say there are not a lot of statues of Xuanzi dotting the horizon. Right. Emergent order is not a concept. I think the Chinese regime has made great leaps after the Great Leap Forward. They have made some great leaps, but it's still incredibly tethered to this. We're going to allow economic freedom insofar as it does not remotely frighten the regime at all one bit. So they've come along, but they're still hardcore statists to their core.
I was thinking in terms of people in the Western tradition. So you definitely get a point for that, because I would not have thought of that example. What I want to start with is,
well, and for the record, since I did explicitly invite you on to talk about the Enlightenment, I am outside of the bounds of the conversation. So
that's true. Yeah, that's why I was looking in terms of the West, because of the Enlightenment. So what I'm thinking about is this: the very fact that today we have, now it's true, there are a lot of screwy economists, right? I mean, sometimes the last place you want to go,
I'd say at least a dozen right now running around.
Yeah, exactly. To understand what's going on is an economist with half these people. But at least in principle, the idea behind economics is that society works according to some kind of cause and effect relationship. It's not all just
people respond
random.
To incentives. There is some kind of system in place. Yeah.
There's some connection between, prices and how much money is in the economy. I mean, they're cause and effect. And it was the people who first began to grope toward that idea that maybe there's not just cause and effect in the hard sciences, like how a magnifying glass works or something, but it's also in society there are cause and effect. And these are people nobody's ever heard of. They're called the Spanish scholastics.
Okay. I'm broadsided. I am utterly unfamiliar. The Spanish scholastics, and when are they writing?
15th and 16th centuries. They're mainly at the University of Salamanca in Spain. And one of the things they're trying to do is make sense of the fact that all the explorers, or some of the explorers anyway, from Europe are coming back from the New World with all these precious metals. And these precious metals, all of a sudden now, they're noting that prices in Europe are going way up. Well, wait a minute. Now they figured out, wait a minute, there's a connection here. No wonder prices are going way up. There's way more money now. And the more money there is, the higher the prices are going to be, than they would have been otherwise. So they started to put cause and effect together. Okay, we got a big, big boon in terms of precious metals, but then all of a sudden we notice the price we have to pay for everything just went up. Maybe there's a connection. So the idea of economics as being maybe a study in its own right starts to develop from that insight from those people.
Which is also an absolutely huge thing to begin, because you think about if you're, let's say you're in 13th century England, you might be on the Privy Council and literally have no idea why anything's going on. Like I imagine they must have had some concept of or some opinion on price fixing, because that's happened since Roman times at least, where the government will come in and dictate the price of bread. So there probably were opinions, but I don't know that people were looking at this from a meta perspective of we pull this lever and other things happen.
Right, exactly, and that's what they started to grope toward, and that's then what the Enlightenment builds on. And that's probably the best part of the Enlightenment, was an understanding among a lot of people that economics tells us a certain number of things about how society works. And you can shake your fist at these things if you want to, but that would be like shaking your fist at the law of gravity. So in other words, if you think some consumer good is too expensive, so you think the solution to that is to have the government force the price down, you're welcome to do that, but the result will be fewer people will supply that product and more people will demand it, which means there'll be shortages. So in other words, there's cause and effect.
Yeah, the main thing, I don't really view myself as an evangelical in terms of my political and economic beliefs, but if there's one concept economically that I could get across the board, it would just be the idea that there's consequences to whatever you do, and many of them are unintended. Because particularly right now, I think we're in a period of sort of high throttle gut legislating from the gut, which is never good. And the amount of we'll if we run out of money, we'll just print more money. Okay. Well, there's you can do that. However, it's not going to be in a vacuum. There are going to be responses from that. So okay, so you've opened up a new rabbit hole for me to go down, which is the 15th and 16th century Solomonican scholastics. And are they, because you say scholastics, so are these Jesuits? Are these professors? Are they priests? What are they doing?
Generally, they are. Some are Jesuits, some are Dominicans.
Okay,
but they're basically following in the tradition of Thomas Aquinas. They're better on economics than Thomas Aquinas was, and they generally come down on the side of a free market. By the way, they generally believe in a free price system.
Really,
they believe in wages to be determined by the market. They have pretty sound opinions on just about everything. But the key insight that you had about that these days it's like we're just legislating from the hip, and this sounds like it's a good idea, so let's just go ahead and do it without thinking that there might be consequences of it. Well, just within the last 24 to 48 hours, or I don't know, this week sometime, Elizabeth Warren came out saying she wants a wealth tax on everybody.
Right, yeah.
And
she's got to catch up with Kamala Harris and catch up with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So she came up with a different plan, yeah.
Right, and when I say on everybody, I mean on the super wealthy. And it's not even like they say, now listen, we know this will have some negative consequences, but we feel confident that the positive results will outweigh the negative one. We're not even told there are any negative consequences. Why? If we want money, we'll just take it from these people because they're the ones who have it. There's no sense of, well, do the rich play any role whatsoever in the economy that might be disrupted by this? Or are they all just sitting around on yachts, smoking cigarettes made out of $100 bills?
Exactly.
Which is their view of what the rich do.
Or there's just kind of I have to explain this all the time of, money, like there's no Scrooge McDuck. Rich people don't have piles of cash sitting in their basement. They're investing them in things. All of that money is doing something. It's not just sitting there. Even if they're parking it in a bank account, the bank is loaning it out to somebody else. So the money itself is active. And with things like that, I'm not. I don't have a Grover Norquist mentality of just all taxes are always bad. There's never a situation where it would be a practical solution. But my concern is you do need to have like a specific thing you're wanting to fund. So if it's, listen, I'm really worried about the deficit, which I am, and I'm really worried about the national debt, which I am, we might have to do something British where what they did a few years ago was we're going to cut 2 pounds for every pound of tax raised. It's like, all right, I see where you're coming from. If the logic is just inequality is bad, let's punish successful people, I do not think that is a very good ideological pillar to build an economy on.
Yeah, no kidding, especially because there's no sense that the rich contribute anything, and that money, as you say, goes to fund the very things that improve our standard of living, which is investment in capital goods that make our production process more productive. We can produce more stuff, so that puts downward pressure on the prices of things. We need money to maintain our productive structure. We need to maintain all the machines and everything we use to produce things. If all we did was take money from rich people and just blow it, at the casino or spend it on a hamburger or whatever, and that's all we did, we would immediately, well, not immediately, but pretty darn quickly, revert to a hand-to-mouth existence. You need big money just to maintain the capital structure we have right now. But there's no sense that they play any role. Even Paul Krugman, who's supposed to be a professional economist, a few weeks ago in the New York Times, had a column saying, look, when we come up with tax policy, we should never, I'm not making this up, I'm not putting words in his mouth, we should never consider the interests of the rich. That is never relevant. The only reason we don't want to punish the rich so much that they stop working is that if they stop working, we can't keep taxing them. Now, that's just astonishing to me.
Because that is the only value of rich people is being bilked for taxes. That's the only,
that's right.
the only good that they provide.
People. Yeah, they're not people. They do some kind of magical thing. We don't know what it is that they're doing all day, but whatever it is, they deserve to be fleeced.
Well, I think that's another important economic distinction that I find is that whether you view wealth as a sort of automatic process that falls from the sky, in which case wealthy people are just more cunning at being able to grab it. It's sort of like if dollars are falling from the sky and they've just got bigger nets, then they don't deserve that much wealth. If you have a more ground up approach, as you and I do, of wealth is created, in that case, then it's obviously rent seeking is bad. But if you're generating value and creating wealth, if you start punishing that, you're attacking the golden goose by virtue of having this emotional response to accumulation of wealth.
And not to mention another. I guess another ground on which they complain is that they believe that even just regular millionaires must have inherited this money or a lot of their money from their families. But 80% of American millionaires are first-generation rich. 80%.
We actually have great social mobility within the super rich, and then Gene Epstein talks about this a fair amount as well. That the dynasties we think of, we can name 2 or 3 in America, but in reality, they don't tend to hold on to wealth, or that accumulation of wealth tends to be about 3 generations, then it's dissipated. And you can point to people like I think Bill Gates has done phenomenal things for all of mankind, both as a philanthropist and just by all of the work he did putting Microsoft together. Thank you. And he's planning on giving away, I think, is it like 90% of his wealth before he dies? And he's actually got a ton of other rich guys to sign on to this. George Lucas, Warren Buffett, all of these people who have voluntarily, without the state coming in and putting a bayonet in their back, decided that they've got plenty of money and they want to give it away before they go. So that sort of fear of a nascent American aristocracy, I really think is misfounded.
And we might add the same thing, of course. These same kinds of complaints were made against the so-called robber barons.
Ah, yes.
And of course, we could get into a whole conversation of that. But I mean, at least a good chunk of those people made their money not because they got government privileges, but because they produced goods that Americans needed super cheaply. Yeah. Like Cornelius Vanderbilt was able to get you from one place to another for a fare that people could actually afford, or he would let you go for free and just hope that you'd buy food on his ship, or you didn't have to go to bed early because you couldn't afford whale oil.
Right, I was about to say Rockefeller got rich selling not whale oil to the average American, so that folks like me who are middle class, folks like most of the people we know could just read at night and not have to pay a ton of money killing a whale like all the rich people. And then he was such a
stickler about waste that he took the byproduct of refined oil and he made 300 different products out of that. But the reason I bring them up is that with the exception of
he owned a top hat. He needs to go down. That's how that works.
That's true. But with the exception of Vanderbilt, generally these people gave away almost their entire fortunes.
Yeah.
As they go.
And Andrew Carnegie, I think he left some amount for his kids, but he did not want to create. In fact, Andrew Carnegie, I went and visited his birthplace when I was in Scotland a couple of years ago, and he was offered, I think, knighthood and things like that, and he did not. He turned them all down. I think he was offered like a dukedom or something, and he did not like the idea of unearned titles and wealth. He was sort of polite to the Queen, but he didn't really like the idea of a monarchy. And gave away a ton of it. I do want to just very quickly, because I didn't read the Paul Krugman article. I don't know the full scope of what he was saying. I can understand where, and I would agree with, when looking at an economic policy, I would be more concerned with the welfare of the poorest people in the country than I am with the top people in the country.
Yeah.
So we see going that route of, our emphasis should be on helping the poor rather than helping the rich, or was it just the rich are only here to produce taxes?
Well, it was generally that since it doesn't make that much difference to the rich if you take some of their money away. They can still do all their fun, frivolous things, but it makes a huge difference to the poor person if you give that person money. He was thinking in terms of redistribution. Now, the trouble, I mean, there are a number of problems with that, but the key one is if we are going to sit there and complain about being, about the 1% and these are terrible people, the problem is if we look at the whole world, Americans are overwhelmingly in the 1% of the whole world. I mean, you barely have to earn not even 50 grand, and you're in the 1% of the whole world. So do you, by extension, think that the rest of the world should have a moral claim on everything you have because you have more than 99%? Well, all of a sudden it's, oh, well, that's different. Yeah, I know it's different because now you have to contribute. So it's something. It's easy when it's those terrible rich people. But when you are called to contribute something, well, that's totally different. They don't live in our country, as if that's morally relevant. If we're talking about morality, what difference should that make? They don't. I actually made a YouTube video, the question Bernie supporters refuse to answer. And they hem and haw and they dance all around it. Because I want to know, why don't you have to divest yourself of all your excess things and ship them around the world? No answer.
And I'll say, like, I've got a few friends in New York who are progressive, and I will add that they're very much into volunteering and they donate to charity, and I think that's fantastic. I have great respect for them. Where I get angry is if the distinction is I am too busy saving up money for my trip to Italy, so I can't donate, but I do want to tax other people who aren't me. To fund the programs that I believe need to be taxed. You need to have some skin in the game for me to really take your argument seriously, unless you truly are impoverished and just can't do it, but are engaging in that thought process. So hold on, before we go down, because I think you and I could get into a thought loop of just agreeing with each other violently for a while. I want to jump forward. So I'm gonna toss out three philosophers, because I do want to touch on social contract theory. I realize it's adjacent to emergent order, but I feel like they're kind of the vanguard of the Enlightenment from what I can tell. Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau. The question I'm going to pose to you is marry, bop, kill.
Let's see.
Marry, bop, kill, Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau.
All right, let's see. Well, I guess marry would be Locke and kill would be Rousseau, and the other one would be Hobbes.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be my, and we'll define in this weird time traveling scenario. Bop would be, I don't want that to be the preeminent philosopher, but there are a couple of good ideas that are worth looking at. And with Hobbes, I don't think Hobbes gets enough credit, to be honest with you. I'm not a Hobbesian, and I don't. I look at Hobbes, and he is this sort of gloomy pessimist, but more disturbingly, he wants the government to rely on terror. From what I can tell, he views the essence of government as terror, and in that capacity, I think is very open and honest about it. I don't like that. What I do like about Hobbes is he seems to be the first kind of, from what I can tell, the first person to espouse the idea that there's a difference between the state and civil society, which is an incredibly powerful distinction to make and gets really built on by subsequent thinkers.
The trouble, though, with Hobbes that everybody can easily point out troubles with him, as indeed you have, but before you get to Hobbes, like in actual European history, society is extremely variegated. That is to say, you have all these different groupings. You have universities that have rights and privileges that can't be restricted. You have guilds of laborers that have their own rights and privileges. You have cities with rights and privileges. You have all these different kinds of groupings. And Hobbes's view is that really, if you have groupings like that any liberties and rights that they have at the permission of the state, because the state has to be the primary source of everything. If we can't have an imperium in imperio, that is to say, we can't have independent power centers within the state. The state has to be infallible and able to impose its will on any person or group. So yeah, we might say, as a practical matter, we'll let you have these certain liberties, but if we need to cancel them tomorrow, we'll do that.
Right.
Because so that's the problem.
He's coming out of, I guess he's sort of at his peak. He's living through the English Civil War.
Right, and that's the worst horror to him.
Right, and so he views. I think the synopsis for I thought about this a lot last night in preparation for this interview. I think Thomas Hobbes, his view of a lack of power is the purge. If you've seen the movie The Purge, that's what Thomas Hobbes thinks the natural state of mankind is, absent a very strong state to intervene. He thinks it is literal anarchy in the streets, bloodshed, people wearing weird rabbit masks, killing their neighbors, things like that. And so you have to have an all-powerful state to step in, because he views order and security as the paramount virtue, and liberty and freedom is sort of secondary, because you're not going to have life without the order and security.
Right, and of course the idea that maybe order and security could come about in some way through liberty and not in spite of it is not, it's not something that's going to occur to somebody, let's say, at that particular moment in history. Yeah,
it's unlikely. And again, the thought process, because then when we jump to Locke, who I am definitely a Lockean, or at least more Lockean than I am Rousseau or Hobbes. Locke is fighting with who, like Robert Fulmer.
Filmer.
Yeah. And Robert Filmer, who I think is kind of. I listened to one of your podcasts, Tom, where he was dismissed by your guest as the village idiot.
Filmer,
philosophers
right.
at the time, Filmer. But basically he was, I think, emblematic of the thought process going on in England and throughout most of Europe, which is God himself has instituted the monarchy, and you can see this because Adam was created by God, and he was given dominion over the animals and everything else, and so the monarchy is just this natural extension of that. And Locke comes in and goes, nope, that's hogwash. We're going to use reason, and he's much more cooperative than Hobbes, he's certainly. Would he be in the? He's kind of pre-spontaneous order. To get back to that, I don't think that's really in the British zeitgeist at that time, right?
Probably not, but he is nevertheless saying things that are going to be helpful for the future. Like, for example, in the Hobbesian way of looking at the world, before there's a state, there really are no rights, because in his view, they're unenforceable. So there's not even a right and wrong really in the pre-political world.
And in fact, according to Hobbes, you are morally right to do whatever you need to defend yourself in a stateless environment. If you need to go kill your neighbor with a pitchfork, there's really nothing wrong with that, because the only responsibility you have is to survive in that world.
Exactly.
Again, the purge.
Locke's going to look at things differently, that you have natural rights in a pre-political state of nature, and the reason that you create the state is that without the state, you enjoy those rights only precariously, and with the state, you can enjoy them with greater security. That's the way he thinks.
Right. So he might be more in line with a minarchist today of you want a state, but you want it to be sort of a night watchman type phenomenon where it's protecting property rights and it's protecting you from violence, but it's not otherwise all powerful.
Yeah, that seems to be more or less it, and a good number of Locke scholars have come to that conclusion. There's a great book on Locke that really goes deeply into his thought, and it's called On the Edge of Anarchy. That's how anti-state Locke is. He's not saying that there's no role for the state, but it's a minimal role.
Right.
Now, I mean, Locke's still going to run into some trouble because he does want the idea that everybody consents to be ruled by the state, and he realizes it's not practically possible to secure the consent of every single person. So he does have to go down the road of, well, they tacitly consent because, that's that sort of thing. But he's still a great advance.
All of him and Hobbes and Rousseau, there's this weird fixation that the British have, and I guess Rousseau is French, have on the idea of social contract, which I think is it's an interesting and valuable mental exercise. But if you're actually trying to presuppose that it happened at some point, which I don't think any of them actually think anyone sat down and forged a social contract. Maybe Runnymede or something was, but you have David Hume come in later and go, nope, this is just nonsense. Don't even bother thinking about it.
Well, things there's so much we can talk about David Hume also, but we still have to get to Rousseau.
Right. Yeah. Tell me. Okay. So we've got Hobbes. We're living in the purge, and you need Leviathan. Which this is a quick question, and I feel stupid asking this. What is a Leviathan? I keep saying this everywhere. I only know it in connection with Hobbes. I think I've read about it in the Bible, but I don't know what it is.
Well, they used it because the image was of it as this great seat of this great monster. In fact, you can see it on the cover of most editions of Leviathan, and so this is the term that's kind of isn't it kind of appropriate then that we would use it to refer to the state, but that's the image that.
So that is the spirit animal that he wanted for the British government. That would be like if a modern Hobbes would be like, he would write the book and call it Cthulhu and say we need a giant sea monster to protect us from other tinier sea monsters.
I suppose so. I mean, I that's all I remember from my old college days. I hadn't thought about it since. Okay.
Well, so Hobbes is living in the purge, summoned Cthulhu to protect us. You've got Locke, who's much more about, human beings are innately cooperative. We need the state to secure our liberties in our life, but beyond that, we don't really need it. How does Rousseau factor into this?
All right. So the idea that we get from, I will say quick thing about David Hume, because it helps to understand Rousseau. David Hume's view about property and justice is that not that one wise lawgiver showed up and told everybody, all right, we're all going to have private property and here's how it's going to work.
Yeah.
Hume imagined that it too emerged spontaneously. As people just figured out on their own, we'd all be a lot safer if everybody kind of like had his own little domain and we all understood that we can't invade anybody else's. We'll all be better off if everybody mutually recognizes this. So he thinks that developed like that.
So he gleans a sort of spontaneous order of property rights?
Yes, exactly. Okay. That's how he sees it occurring. In the same way that Ludwig von Mises in the 20th century would say that money came about that way. That, the government has an involvement later, but initially people didn't need to be told that money would make their lives better. They figured it out, and so likewise with property, they figured it out. Whereas Rousseau kind of thinks of property as a trick that wily and wicked people play on the public.
Okay.
Because he says, of course, that the beginning of all conflict occurred when the first person stood on some ground and said, "This is mine." But the reality is,
I kind of doubt that. So our species is what, 300,000 years old. We've been sedentary for maybe 12,000 years of it, perhaps 20,000 years of it. I'm pretty sure there was a lot of violence going on pre 20,000 years ago. We were killing each other with sticks.
Kidding.
Yeah.
But honestly, he thinks these are wicked conventions that have been introduced into human society that have deprived mankind of its natural innocence. And so, in other words, we've been corrupted by institutions, that we're naturally good, but we've been corrupted by institutions like property. But of course, from our point of view, property is what makes peace possible, because what Hume pointed out even hundreds of years ago was that what we face is two problems in society. Number one is scarcity. We have more desires than we have things. There are only so many berries, but yet we'd all like to have a full belly full of them. Mm-hmm. There are only so many cruise ships, but we'd all like to go sailing on one. So there's scarcity. We have to figure out who gets what, or we're all going to be fighting about it. And secondly, there's the fact that human beings' hearts extend only so far. We don't have an equal love for somebody on the other end of the world that we have for our own children. Mm-hmm. We have to factor these two facts into our minds, and the result of realizing these things about us is that we need to have property titles, because then that solves the problem of scarcity, that we all want to do X, but there's only 3 X's and 5 of us. We have to figure out, okay, well, who's going to have what and how are they going to acquire it? We have to have rules to settle this. And likewise, the fact that I don't necessarily feel for somebody 500 miles away I've never met as I feel for my own children. All right, well, we're going to have property, so that I can work and acquire property for myself and my kids can have it. I'll actually want to do the work if I know where the proceeds are going. We have to introduce these institutions because this is the nature of mankind, he said. But this is the opposite for Rousseau. He thinks that these institutions pervert the naturally good and generous nature of mankind. Now, it's funny for him to say that, because he had at least 5 children, and he gave them up to a foundling asylum where they were just going to be working
really?
For the rest of their lives.
Oh.
And he's all tears and pity for mankind, but when it comes to actual human beings in his life, he was an SOB.
Well, I think you've drawn what strikes me as the biggest distinction between Locke and Rousseau. Locke views history as a kind of pit that we've climbed out of, and that we need to embrace the right systems to encourage that further flourishing. Whereas Rousseau sees it as this kind. I guess he's a romantic, or he's a proto-romantic. He sees a glorious, or at least more emotionally fulfilling past that we have forsaken, and we need to get back to that. And we're going to get back to that by tearing down all of the artificial scaffolding that we've erected.
Right, and that can be, and that kind of thing in the hands of the state, where is frankly where some of the worst aspects of the French Revolution come from. The idea that we're going to decide which aspects of society are stupid and backward and need to be removed. Now, sometimes there are stupid and backward things in society that need to be removed. But the idea that, and that's going to mean that we have to execute 50,000 of you because you're too stupid and you're too stuck to the old and backward views, this becomes a bit of a problem. So he's willing to, or likewise he says that what the legislator needs to do is to somehow discern the general will. But the general will is not the sum of individual wills. It's something that the legislator will intuit and then force on the population. And if anybody objects, well, he must be crazy because it's the general will. It's what he himself ought to want. I mean, it's just every totalitarian permission.
This is very Napoleonic too, right? Because Napoleon, who becomes emperor of the French, he views himself, at least in how he describes it, Napoleon views himself not as a royalist, but rather as the physical embodiment of the French Revolution. The French, all of the sentiments of the French Revolution have come together in him, and therefore he has picked up the crown of France that he found in the gutter with a sword, and is now living it. And I see traces of this. I see this a lot in populism, where whenever people start talking about what the people want, I'm like, well, I'm one of the people, and you may not speak for me. The president very rarely speaks for me. Bernie Sanders very rarely speaks for me. And there's this kind of idea that there's this huge block of people, and I am their spiritual spokesman. And I'm like,
exactly.
Well, I didn't sign up to be a part of that.
No, that's right. And in fact, that really is the core of fascism, is the idea of the leader as the spiritual embodiment of the will of the people. And he's going to lead them into their glorious new future, regardless of the obstacles. And it is worth noting in American history that all the way back in the 1820s, when Andrew Jackson was running for president, he portrayed himself as being the spokesman of the representative of the American people. Mm-hmm. And today, that doesn't seem like anything unusual because every president says, I'm the spokesman of the American people. Yeah. But at the time, there was a concern. People were saying there is no such thing as the American people. We have the people of Massachusetts, the people of South Carolina, the people of Virginia. We don't have a single blob of the American people. We don't want there to be one guy who thinks that he rules over the whole American people.
Which is a fascinating headspace to get into, and it's hard for me to even really think that way now. Like when I first read about, I think it's not the XYZ affair, but there's early on, maybe I think it's in the Jefferson administration, there's an American citizen who just goes to England to negotiate on behalf of America post-war. Something. I don't remember what it was, but he basically just deputizes himself, and he's like, I'll go over. And they have to step in and go, look, we can't just have some guy. You have to be an ambassador or a minister or something. But there was sort of a mindset of like, why does this have to? There was such a depreciation of the state itself and a concept of civil society being much, much larger and the state being sort of subordinate to it. Whereas now, I think that's just part and parcel. We're all part of that. I'm beginning to think that there is a sort of weird hanger-on from divine right rule that we have gradually intuited in a democracy. And I like democracy, by the way. And as soon as the separatists have been quelled, I will reinstate the republic and put down my emperorship. But no, with divine right rule, I look at it like I kind of view the government as a corporation that we have given certain powers to. It's a big corporation. We've given a monopoly of taxation and violence to it. But I don't view it as having any type of sanctified state. There's nothing that has spiritually cleansed it and given it superpowers. Whereas if you're a divine right royalist, the king has been appointed by God. And I almost feel like democracy has that cleansing effect on government rule, where it's like, well, no, because it's democracy, therefore this is spiritually okay for us to do this. And I'm like, I like the democracy. I want to keep it. I don't know that it automatically becomes, morally permissible, or it has some sort of supernatural identity separate than what I would view as a corporation. That's a better way of putting it.
I think it was Herbert Spencer, who 19th century figure everybody's been taught to hate.
Oh yeah, the social Darwinist and the font of all evils therewith.
Right, and it turns out this is not really true about him, but that was his concern. His concern was that the problem, he says, is this idea that we should have this infallible voice that has plenary power over the lives and property of everybody in society. I don't care if that's one person or 500 people. This is beside the point. And so in other words, the fact that we vote for 500 representatives and they're going to make the decisions, the fundamental principle is the same.
So I'm slowly going to wind this down because I know you're a busy man and I don't want to keep you too long. However, a couple of people worth bringing up when we're talking about spontaneous order, emergent order. I am new to him, but Adam Ferguson, who is part of the Scottish Enlightenment, like David Hume you mentioned earlier. Adam Ferguson, I think, is the first one to kind of coin the term spontaneous order, or at least describe it, which he says the result of human action, he says spontaneous order is the result of human action, but not necessarily the execution of any human design. And I'm paraphrasing. I think I've got the quote wrong. But he kind of pops in. And then I think Adam Smith, I hesitate to describe Adam Smith as a spontaneous order. I think everybody brings up the invisible hand, but I feel like the invisible hand is more a description of a net good resulting from self-interest than it is of organizational principles.
But yet, when we put all these ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment together, we still get something that's pretty extraordinary. And again, it's just as we were saying at the very beginning. We're surrounded by order out of liberty every single day, but we don't notice it. And to me, the thing that actually got me on board was an economic insight. And when I learned I instantly realized that the economy does indeed run itself. And it was just simply this. Is simply the idea that, let's say there's a huge increase in demand for ordinary pencils. So what's that going to mean? It's going to mean people realize that, okay, there's an increased demand. I can make some money satisfying this demand. So you get more pencil factories, let's say. But you can't infinitely create pencil factories because then you're going to overdo it and you'll barely be able to unload your inventory. Nobody's going to want that many. So there is some kind of, I hate to use the word equilibrium, but there is some kind of a level reached where you realize, all right, this many pencil factories is not enough. This is too many. This is the right amount. And the way we know that is that people stop being willing to buy the pencils at a level that's profitable. So you realize, okay, it's silly for me to make more pencils. And what society is saying is, if you were to make more pencils, you'd be wasting our resources because we'd rather have ballpoint pens now. And so when profits go low or become negative and become losses, you don't need anybody with a bullhorn to say, okay, all you marginal pencil producers, time to exit the industry. Their bottom line will be quite sufficient to let them know they've got to exit the industry. Whereas when they're making super duper profits, you don't need a guy in a bullhorn saying, hey, big opportunity in pencils, everybody, hop on over. People see the profits and they go into pencils. So in other words, that is how the economy regulates itself, through profit. And so you don't need some fallible human being telling people, go pursue your self-interest. I'm pretty sure they'll do it on their own. Yeah,
I'm with you. So before I let you go, is there any particular person that follows this? We've got up to Adam Smith, so we've got up to the Scottish Enlightenment, which is a fascinating and wonderful time. Is there anybody post that you really think is worth bringing up related to spontaneous order, be it Hayek, be it Bastiat, somebody like that made a huge contribution in terms of either promulgating it or refining the concept?
Well, you mentioned Hayek. I don't know about this particular aspect of what I think in the 20th century, we got a lot of people who started writing case studies of here's an actual example of a spontaneous thing. Like, there have been interesting studies of how in prisoner of war camps, how money spontaneously emerges in prisoner of war camps. I mean, under the most horrifying circumstances, you see spontaneous order developing. So there have been a lot of great case studies. To me, what is the other flip side of the spontaneous order is that there's mutual benefit all around too. I mean, we have both order and we have prosperity and mutual benefit. And that was one of the great insights of Frederick Bastiat. He had a great collection called Economic Harmonies. Just those two words. I'm such a dork, but those are two of my favorite
You just
words.
swoon when you hear that?
Yeah, in economic. In fact, I think I even have heaven help me, I have a T-shirt with his face on that says Economic Harmonies on it, that we all benefit. I mean, when rich people make profits and they pour those profits into investment that, for example, my father was a forklift operator. I'm glad that the business had the money to pay for a forklift because my father could command a higher wage with the forklift. No way he was going to command that wage if he had to lift all those pallets with his bare hands. He couldn't even have done it, much less commanded a wage. So it benefited him that the rich guy got that profit because now the forklift he bought with the profit makes my father's labor more productive, and therefore he commands a higher wage. There are economic harmonies. There are things we should all want. We don't have to think about society as being a low-intensity civil war of one group against another. So there's a kind of order there, too, that we all want. What makes, what brings about prosperity are policies that we should all equally want. And to me, that's the flip side of the spontaneous order, is that even here, I mean, yeah, we get a lot of cool miracles through spontaneous order, but we also get justice and we get prosperity through spontaneous order.
I think all of those are excellent points. Is there with the idea? I liked your phrase "low-level civil war." That was kind of a turning point for me when I discovered the economic concept of zero-sum game and the zero-sum game fallacy. Is there a particular thinker that sort of espoused that, or did that just kind of creep in? Because that is very powerful. If you think that there is a fixed amount of resources and our job is to apportion them as fairly as possible, you've missed the entire game. And were that the case, we'd be talking about how to redistribute caves and rocks. The economy grows. And which is why a frequent thing I come out on the podcast. At some point, I'm going to do an episode on inequality because people keep requesting it. But that's why I keep emphasizing I'm concerned about poverty. I'm not concerned about inequality because I want that pie to grow. Is there anybody that sort of is the patron saint of zero-sum fallacies? Of fighting them or originating them? I'd say fighting them. I imagine that idea probably goes back very, very far in the past. I think there's a lot of inertia there.
Although Mises, the 20th century economist, called it, he was talking about the French philosopher Montaigne, who was in the 16th century. He was a French philosopher. He calls it the Montaigne fallacy. It's Montaigene. Mm-hmm. The idea that it's just a fixed pie. That he gave that fallacy the name and named after that person. So Mises certainly, but Mises is very late. He's a 20th century figure. So I mean, I would say Adam Smith, I think, understands about the creation of wealth. I mean, after all, he is talking about the wealth of nations. And he is trying to also make clear to the mercantilists, because remember, the mercantilists were completely of the zero-sum fallacy. That was their whole trade philosophy. Yep. That it was based on if one country benefits, another country must lose. What Smith was trying to show is that there's mutual benefit. And not just Smith, but others. His main target was the mercantilists, who had a whole lot of cockamamie economic ideas. And in fact, we talked about Murray Rothbard earlier. When he wrote his History of Economic Thought and he got to the mercantilists, by that point, he had talked about all different thinkers over the course of history. But when he got to the mercantilists, he said, you know what? I can't even dignify these people by calling them a school of economics. They are just apologists for special privilege. Their economic ideas are total nonsense. They are just spinning rationalizations for policies that enrich certain people, and I'm just going to come out and say that.
Yeah, I like that. I don't think they need any slack. We'll end up on in this romp across the Enlightenment. We'll end up on Adam Smith then, and I think just to put a hat on it, I think he's got what is the quote that the grocer does not feed you out of altruism, but out of self-interest, or something like that. This concept that you can have a society composed of people, I don't want to say selfish, just because we get into a whole linguistic argument and discussion, but the idea that everybody is operating out of self-interest, there can still be a net good and a net positive that comes out of that, which is also a hugely powerful concept.
Absolutely. So,
Tom, I have had a pleasure talking to you. I feel like I should have drank more coffee to keep up with you. I'm
trying to keep up with you. You're a tough guy.
Thank you. Well, it's always a pleasure talking to you in any capacity, but I am thrilled that I got to nerd out and just talk to you about economics and history. Thank you so much. Do you have any projects you're working on right now, or you want to make a pitch for your podcast or anything like that?
Well, I would say, I'll make one pitch. I talk an awful lot about the Federal Reserve, which has caused a lot of economic problems. So I just released a free ebook called Our Enemy, the Fed. So I'm the king of domain names. I bought ourenemythefed.com. So I would recommend people go, if you don't know what the Fed is, but you have the funny feeling you probably ought to, this is all, I'll get you up to speed in one afternoon at ourenemythefed.com.
Wonderful. Well, Tom, again, thank you so much for coming on. And I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Andrew.
All right, folks, as I leave you for the weekend, let me tell you that what I refer to as my sister podcast, Contra Krugman, which I record once a week with Bob Murphy, the economist, this particular episode that's come out this week is number 175, contrakrugman.com/175. This is another one, 2 in a row, where we just took it up a notch. We just had so much fun doing this episode and the previous one. We've been recording them late at night for one reason or another. And for some reason, I just laugh more. We just have more fun when we do them late at night. So I hope you enjoy that over the weekend. If you got some house chores, something you're driving around, and you're all out of Tom Woods Show episodes, check out Contra Krugman, and in particular, episode 175, because it doesn't even matter what the subject is. We just have a lot of fun. We got some good content in there, and it'll definitely keep you entertained. So check out contrakrugman.com, and I'll see you next week.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit TomWoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.